must-know wiring to configure. Most of the configuration pages are for Universal Avionics approved avionics shops and technicians to perform. Configuration changes can only be performed on the ground. You cannot make any configuration changes to the FMS in flight. Changes are performed through the FMS CDU. Configuration is necessary during installation or upgrades. This normally doesn't include point change upgrades, but that really depends on your certification. If your FMS is certified as 1000.X, you won't need to reconfigure. However, if you are certified as 1000.7, you will need to reconfigure when upgrading to 1000.8. There are two locations where the FMS configuration is stored: the configuration module and the NCU. Changing the FMS configuration requires an access code. It records the date and time of the last 4 configuration changes. The configuration module is actually connected to the wiring of the aircraft. It's not part of the CDU, it's a separate component plugged into the navigation computer unit. For the EW model that has the NCU and CDU combined in one box, the configuration module is located on the P1 connector strain relief. For the FW and LW models that have the NCU as a separate unit, the configuration module is mounted on the NCU rack. The configuration module stores the configuration of the FMS. Why is that important? Let's say you need to send your FMS into Universal Avionics for a battery change, and you install a temporary replacement FMS. After you install the loaner FMS, the first thing it will do when you turn it on is compare its configuration to the one stored in the configuration module. If the two configurations do not match, it downloads the data stored in the configuration module. Since the configuration stored within the module is set for your particular aircraft, the loaner FMS is now configured for your airplane. That loaner FMS could have come out of a Lear 35 or a Boeing 727. It doesn't matter. That FMS is now configured for your particular airplane exactly as it was when you first removed your original FMS. The only caveat to this is that the new FMS must have the same software version as the original FMS. That's why you don't need to change the configuration when installing a replacement FMS. As long as the software is the same, it will operate as if designed for your aircraft exclusively. This is what's going to happen pretty much every time you turn on your FMS. The FMS configuration is valid and the configuration module is valid, and they both match. In this situation, you won't get any messages and the FMS will use its current configuration. What happens if the FMS configuration and the configuration module are both valid but do not match? The configuration module will update the FMS automatically. This is normal, so again, no messages. What happens if the configuration module has invalid data? You will get a message that the configuration module has failed. This will require maintenance. What will the FMS use for its configuration? It will use its current configuration. What happens if it's the FMS that has invalid configuration data? The module will again update the FMS, and since this is automatic, you won't get a message. What happens if both the FMS and the configuration module have invalid data? You will get two messages: configuration module failed and configuration update required. This will require configuring the FMS. This will happen whenever you change your software. The avionics technicians will have to reprogram the FMS configuration. When that configuration is stored, it will update the configuration module, and they will both be the same again. If you don't press Store, the changes to the FMS won't be saved, and the configuration module will not be updated. Configuration checks are found on Maintenance Page 1. You can compare the values with a configuration sheet. You can also edit the configuration. You must first enter the unlock code to edit the system. To do so, go to the Date field, which is found either on the Initialization page or Data page 4. Enter this code and press Enter. The date returns to normal. You probably don't want to give this code to the pilots. They will try to do things thinking they know the answer and will only cause problems. Pilots have actually messed up the configuration so badly that the FMS wouldn't fly. So someone has to reconfigure it. If you don't have a copy of the configuration, that could be very problematic. If you do nothing else, get a copy of the configuration in case you have to reconfigure it. Let me qualify that statement about pilots. They actually have the code in their reference manual. However, few realize that, and even fewer understand what they can do with that code. When you pressed Enter, the date returned to normal, and it looks as if you didn't do anything. But what we've done is unlock the Edit Configuration function. Go to Maintenance, and then to Config. We need to do one more thing to edit the configuration. Press Edit. You can now edit the FMS configuration. Just select the Group option and then the specific configuration option you want changed. When you're completely done editing with everything on these configuration pages, press the Store line select key twice. It will reboot the system. This is the process that writes the configuration to the module. So if you make an error here, the configuration module will now be wrong as well, which is again why we don't tell the code to the pilots. If you leave the configuration pages, it doesn't store your changes. You must press Store twice. Let's look at some of the options you are most likely to configure. If you select the fuel option, you can change the aircraft's basic weight. You can also have weights displayed in either pounds or kilograms. From the Performance option page, you can select the minimum length for displayed divert runways. If the pilot selects the divert option on the Direct To page, this configuration will filter out all airports with runways shorter than this configuration. On the VNAV option page, selecting the Temp Comp field to cold allows the FMS to compensate for cold weather during descents. The FMS can be configured by maintenance for either push or pull. With the push mode, the transmitting FMS will initiate the crossfill process. With the pull mode, the receiving FMS will initiate the process. The pull configuration is the default configuration. On the WAAS configuration page are the antenna offsets used during the WAAS antenna confirmation tests. On FMS config page 3, you can configure the maximum time the FMS may be placed into standby. When the FMS is in standby, it enables the FMS to store the flight plan and fuel plan after it is shut down, but only for as long as the configured time. You can also configure whether or not pilot-defined waypoints from the previous flight will be deleted at power on. Normally, airlines that employ a company routes database will usually select cleared, while those that do not use a company routes database select retained. On the configuration page 2 is the SCN that is loaded in the FMS. The field must match the FMC on software version page and reflect actual software load. The line below that contains the aircraft ID. This field is based on user preference, usually the tail number. Use the plus and minus sign for spaces. I mentioned earlier that the last 4 configuration changes are stored, and this is where. I need to emphasize that the FMS does not store the configurations themselves, just the date and time they were last updated. You cannot go back and reload an old configuration. So far, I have mentioned 3 different types of SCNs. Let me clarify them at this time. The first SCN is the one listed in your supplemental type certificate. It could be listed as either a number .x, or a number and later versions. Think of this as the SCN version or versions you are legally allowed to use in your aircraft. Another type of SCN that I just mentioned is what is shown on configuration page 2. This could be listed as a number as shown here, or as a number.x. Think of this as the software versions that can be loaded into your FMS without requiring a reconfiguration. You cannot configure your FMS for a software version for which you do not have an STC. Finally, we have the SCN that is actually loaded into the FMS. You cannot load into your FMS any software for which it is not configured.